let us turn our attention to a truly significant vessel in Soviet naval history, the Leningrad. Historically classified as a destroyer leader, this ship is technically known as Project 1. That designation is actually quite important, as the Leningrad marked the moment Soviet shipbuilding officially adopted the system of using numerical designations for their ship projects. But to really understand the purpose of this class of ship, we have to look back at the broader history of naval warfare. The ancestors of these destroyer leaders were the mine cruisers of the late 19th century. In essence, these were gunboats armed with torpedoes, sitting in that awkward gap between small torpedo boats and larger light cruisers. Their primary job was to hunt down and counter enemy torpedo forces. Internationally, this concept evolved into the torpedo boat destroyer, a term eventually shortened to simply destroyer. At the time, major maritime powers like Germany and Great Britain were aggressively developing this type of vessel. However, after the Russo-Japanese War, naval strategists learned a hard lesson. Daytime torpedo attacks were losing their effectiveness. This created a need for a specialized ship, a flotilla leader. This vessel had a very specific job: to carry the commander and the division staff, to coordinate the attacks of a group of destroyers, and to provide heavy fire support to protect them from enemy light forces. There were attempts to assign these duties to scout cruisers, similar to those being built by the United States Navy at the time, but the results were underwhelming. These scouts lacked the necessary speed and armor, leaving them stranded between being an effective destroyer and a proper cruiser. As technology raced forward, the scout concept quickly became obsolete. Instead, naval evolution moved toward the concept of the super destroyer. By the early 20th century, these ships were displacing up to 2,400 tons, a massive size compared to the standard torpedo boats of the era, which usually barely exceeded 1,000 tons. In fact, standard ships of that period often displaced only 200 to 600 tons. It was the British who really pushed the super destroyer concept forward, leading to the first true destroyer leaders. Naturally, these British designs became the template for navies around the world. Now shift the scene to Russia. Following the change of the political regime, the new Soviet leadership faced the daunting task of rebuilding their naval forces despite a severe lack of shipbuilding experience. Their strategic planning had to cover 4 massive operational theaters: the Northern, Baltic, Far Eastern, and Black Sea fleets. They needed to restore the balance of power. The Black Sea, in particular, became a region of intense rivalry. By the 1930s, Romania possessed a significant naval potential and had begun constructing 2 large destroyers based on the British Shakespeare-class leaders. This was the catalyst. The appearance of these powerful ships in a neighboring fleet spurred the Soviet Union to begin constructing their own ships of a similar class. It is worth noting that the Soviets had been working on designs as early as 1921. They were developing a concept called the improved Novik. The specifications were ambitious for the time. They planned for torpedo tubes of either 533 millimeters, that is 21 inches, or even larger. They considered artillery up to 180 millimeters, or roughly 7 inches, and the ability to carry up to 100 naval mines. The projected range was 3,000 nautical miles, with a top speed of around 40 knots. The original hope was to realize these plans by 1925. However, ambition ran headlong into reality. The industrial base simply wasn't ready, and the ships could not be laid down under those early programs. It was not until the 1930s, when industrial equipment and expertise had finally caught up, that they could return to the project. Driven by the new Romanian threats, the need for these destroyer leaders became critical, not just for the Black Sea, but for the safety of Soviet borders across all their fleets. Ultimately, under the designation known as Project 1, 3 destroyer leaders were constructed. This series marked a pivotal moment in naval history, as these were the very first large surface warships developed entirely by Soviet specialists, relying solely on domestic design experience. Because the designers lacked previous experience with vessels of this class, they conducted an extensive regimen of trials, including rigorous testing in towing tanks. The goal of this research was to find the optimal hull lines to achieve a projected speed of no less than 40 knots. However, arming these ships proved to be a significant challenge during the development process. The B-13 naval gun, which would later become standard on the Leningrad-class destroyers, was originally developed specifically for these Leningrad-class leaders. By the time the keels were laid in the early 1930s, the artillery system existed only on paper. A prototype appeared by 1935, but it was plagued by more than 50 technical flaws. Nevertheless, driven by the urgent need to get these ships into service, the Navy accepted the gun, and the final fine-tuning had to be done directly on the ships over the following several years. A similar situation unfolded with the 45mm anti-aircraft guns and the larger 76mm mounts, which were created specifically for this project before later becoming standardized. Crucially, fire control systems and torpedo directors were initially non-existent domestically, forcing the Soviets to purchase them from Italy. It was not until the late 1930s that homegrown equivalents were finally developed. Construction of the lead ship on the slipway took about 2 years, followed by a lengthy fitting-out period afloat. Alongside the Leningrad, the leaders Moskva and Kharkov were also built. As they gradually entered service in the late 30s, they demonstrated incredible performance. On trials, they achieved blistering speeds, with some reports citing up to 43 knots on the measured mile. However, the rushed construction timeline and the complexity of the propulsion plant led to reliability issues. Engineers noted burnouts in the boiler tubes and other components. Consequently, shortly after her commissioning, around 1938, the Leningrad had to be sent back for repairs. In the pre-war period, the ships underwent regular modernization and routine maintenance. While the Moskva and Kharkov were based in the Black Sea, the Leningrad joined the Baltic Fleet. It was there that the ship saw its first combat action during the Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland. By this time, the artillery armament, specifically the refined second series of B-13 guns, proved highly effective. With an elevation angle of 45 degrees, a rate of fire reaching 10 to 12 rounds per minute, and a firing range of 25 kilometers or about 15.5 miles, they were formidable weapons. The barrel life and magazine capacity allowed for sustained fire support. The auxiliary artillery was also versatile, engaging both aerial and ground targets. During the conflict, the ship's primary missions became the bombardment of coastal batteries and enemy fortifications, as well as laying minefields, a key function of destroyer squadrons. The focus on artillery support and mining was dictated by the fact that the adversary lacked any major naval forces to engage in open battle. The execution of these tasks met with mixed success. Due to significant damage sustained from coastal battery fire, the vessel spent practically the entire combat period undergoing repairs. In fact, during the pre-war years, the ship was dry docked 9 times, specifically for re-riveting the hull. These extensive works were necessary because the hull plating sheets were separating, predominantly in the underwater section. This was a direct result of design flaws and the shipbuilder's lack of sufficient experience. However, one must remember, this was the very first warship of its kind to be completely developed within the country. When the war began, this destroyer leader was immediately thrown into the defense of Tallinn, a city that was already surrounded on the landward side. Working alongside other surface vessels, she provided crucial fire support, hammering enemy crossings and supply lines. Some sources even claim her guns took out as many as 20 tanks. Between these artillery duels, the crew also managed to lay defensive minefields. Later, she joined the desperate evacuation operation known as the Tallinn Crossing to Kronstadt. Her mission was to screen the heavy cruiser Kirov and assist her sister ship, the destroyer leader Minsk. Now, the Minsk was a Project 38 vessel, essentially a refined and improved version of the original design. During the crossing, Minsk struck a mine and suffered severe damage. Despite the chaos, our destroyer managed to shepherd the crippled leader safely to Kronstadt. It was a tense journey. On the way, her gunners used the 45mm auxiliary guns to detonate several floating mines in their path. Once at Kronstadt, the tactical situation demanded she join the defense system of Leningrad itself. Her primary job became counter-battery fire, dueling with the German artillery positions that were besieging the city. It was brutal warfare, characterized by a high density of incoming fire directed by enemy spotters. Inevitably, the ship took a hit. Several water and fuel tanks were flooded, and a fire broke out on board. She was forced to dock for repairs, but even there was no respite. The shipyard came under regular bombardment. The destroyer leader also attempted to help evacuate the garrison from the Hanko Peninsula. This was a nightmare scenario, as the German fleet had heavily mined the approaches to the island. The attempt to reach the objective ended in failure. About 60 miles from their destination, the group sailed right into a minefield. Mines were detonating in their sweeping gear, and one or two exploded just 5 meters from the ship's hull. The shockwave flooded 7 fuel tanks. After anchoring to pump out the water, she had to be towed by a minesweeper to Gogland Island, eventually limping back to Kronstadt without completing the mission. From that point on, the ship rarely left her base. However, she still provided massive artillery support for the 55th Army during the operation to break the Siege of Leningrad. Her 5 130mm guns, roughly comparable in power to 122mm field artillery, allowed her to deliver devastating fire out to a radius of 25 kilometers. She played a real role in the city's liberation. After the blockade was finally lifted, her activity remained limited for the rest of the war, simply due to the immense danger of mines still lurking in the waters. In the post-war years, specifically 1949, she was reclassified simply as a destroyer. By 1956, she underwent a major overhaul and modernization, only to be designated as a target ship shortly after. She was briefly returned to the Northern Fleet to serve as a floating barracks, but by 1962, her fate was sealed. She became a target vessel once again. The end came in the White Sea. She was targeted by a P-35 cruise missile launched from the cruiser Grozny. Despite taking 2 clean hits where the missiles punched right through her hull, the old ship stubbornly refused to sink immediately. A rescue operation using a tug and pontoons was planned for the morning, but she went down during the night. Later, she was actually raised from the bottom, but the structural damage was critical. It was considered too dangerous to transport her any great distance. Instead, the wreck was towed to the Solovetsky Islands. Presumably, she is still there today. Her exact location is not marked on any navigation charts, and no photographic evidence of the wreck exists. While the Leningrad survived to tell her tale, her sister ships, the Moskva and the Kharkov, were not so fortunate. Both were lost to the unforgiving nature of active combat. The destroyer leader Moskva met her end on June 26, 1941, just 4 days after the war began, during a daring raid on the Romanian port of Constanta. There is a persistent theory that this tragedy was actually a case of friendly fire. It is believed she was mistakenly torpedoed by the Soviet submarine Shish-206, whose commander had not been informed about the maneuvers of the surface fleet. When the wreck of the Moskva was finally discovered in 2011, about 30 kilometers or roughly 19 miles from Constanta, it offered a clue to her fate. Resting at a depth of 45 meters, which is about 150 feet, the hull was found broken completely in half. This kind of catastrophic damage suggests a massive detonation of her ammunition magazines or a direct torpedo hit, rather than a simple collision with a sea mine. Interestingly, there are no records of any disciplinary actions taken against the crew of the submarine. As for the leader Kharkov, she was eventually hunted down and sunk by German aviation on October 6, 1943, shortly after she had completed a shore bombardment mission off the coast of southern Crimea. But the Leningrad herself remains a vessel of immense historical significance. As the lead ship of the project, she was the pioneer. She was the first to be fitted with a new generation of weaponry, including the formidable B-13 artillery system. She proved her worth during the Winter War against Finland and went on to play a truly vital role in the desperate defense of the city of Leningrad.